Good morning. I'm reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You've already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit. Because apart from me, you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. May God add a blessing to this reading.
Thank you, Luann. You know, sometimes, as Amanda was talking about just a little bit ago, I think we have the opportunity for a disconnect with sometimes some of the stories in the Bible or the metaphors and the examples used in the Bible. Obviously, in Jesus' day, it was a far more agrarian society and culture. I think people were more accustomed to working in and with the land than most suburban folks in our time are. Although there's a number of you who I think enjoy gardening and getting back out in the yard. Several of you probably do things chickens are sort of in vogue right now, right? I mean, a lot of people are getting chickens again. Does anybody have any goats? I know here in this neighborhood, the HOA would lose their mind if you brought a goat in, but no goats in the congregation. The Ingrams have to have a goat, don't you? No, not yet. Not yet. Okay, the year is still young. But I think that in some of examples of in the Bible, again, to Amanda's point, like we're talking about vines and branches and things like that we probably have an idea of, but it's not part of sort of daily experience where Jesus' examples are always the ones that make perfect sense to us. And yet, every once in a while, there's one that sort of clicks or resonates, I think, in a powerful way. We bought one of those smokeless fire pits for the backyard several years ago. We use it, love it. It's fun to sit around in the back. It's very relaxing to watch the fire crackle. And every fall, when I'm doing the big final fall cleaning of the backyard, you know, kind of the last one before the yard feels winterized and ready to not do much and everything's sort of fallow until spring, we end up having a lot of different kinds of plants in our flower garden that get pretty tall. Some of them well over my head, and a lot of them just about shoulder high on me, and they sort of leave these dead stalks or stems. And really, I think, you know, in the wild, it'd probably be fine to leave it alone, but it's easy to go by and clip those and snap those off, and some of them are hollow, kind of more like almost like a really kind of a thin bamboo kind of a feel. And what ends up happening is I set those in a little pile, and then the next time we go out to that fire pit, I just add those in first. They make perfect sort of dry kindling. And I got to thinking about that when I was reading this passage about Jesus talking about himself and the vine. And I think for many of us, particularly those of us who are really uncomfortable with the idea of anytime we find anything in the scripture that talks about like twigs, they will be burned on the fire. It makes us uneasy. That sort of, well, it's not the kind of Christianity that I really get excited about. And what do we do when Jesus talks about that? So let's just address that really quickly. Jesus is talking about, in many ways, what I think gardeners would talk about is pruning, right? And let's keep in mind that he's talking to his disciples in this moment. Jesus is not saying, "This I hereby declare for humanity for all time." He's looking at his followers and saying, you must abide in me. You must live your lives in me. The way that you see the world, I want you to see it as I would. I want the heart that I have to be the heart that you have. And so you and I are one in this sort of goal and how we look at the world and how we think that the world should be and what a world of justice and mercy and grace and love looks like. I want to teach you about seeing the world through my eyes. So if I am the vine, then you are like the branches. You are my students. You are my disciples that come off of me. And sometimes, off of some of the shoots of the branches, there will come some things that aren't helpful. There's all kinds of examples in the Bible where Jesus tells one of his disciples, which the Bible usually refers to as rebuking, right? Where Jesus is offering a corrective for the disciples and says, no, that's not helpful, or you're going in the wrong direction, or I know where your heart is coming from, but that's not the right way to look at this. And he corrects them. And when he does so, I suppose if you're following this vine and branches metaphor, that would be like a pruning of the thing that was unhelpful. And then that piece, like everybody would have done in Jesus' time, becomes kindling for the next fire. It's thrown on the fire. So I think of this in reading about this as Jesus saying, these are the things that I want you to understand. These are the things that I want you to glean from my teachings. And here are some things that are less helpful or counterproductive or maybe misguided on your part. Let's prune those, toss those into the pile, and let's proceed with the healthy growth. But I think many of us bristle and we say, ooh, that sounds like if you don't abide in Jesus, then you're throwing on some fit fire to burn for eternity. And it's really not what he's saying here. And isn't it interesting that so many of us, our minds would go to that kind of place, right? I think some of you just said, ew, I don't really like that part. Otherwise, I was with the parable or the message, the metaphor was great until we got to that part. It made me uncomfortable. But I think if we're thinking about if we abide in Jesus, or we strive to abide in Jesus, and we grow healthy branches, there will be also offshoots that are unhelpful or counterproductive, right? I think that we could all come up with many examples of things that probably deserve to be pruned in our lives. If it wouldn't sound just like me doing therapy or confession, I could probably come up with a long list of things that need to be pruned on the regular from my life, and you could do the same thing. So prune those off and let the healthy stuff grow. We've got a crepe myrtle in the backyard, planted it a couple of years ago. Actually had to pull it out because it wasn't in a sunny enough spot. Now it's in a thriving spot. Thriving so much, in fact, that we've got 3 big trunks coming from the base that are about this big around each. And every few months, I got to go out there and trim another little offshoot that came up from the bottom that's about this long. Also have a bunch of Japanese maple trees. We've got these volunteer Japanese maples that keep growing on the side of the house. I dig them up and I plant them in the backyard. And they grow up a little bit. But if you don't trim off the little shoots coming off the bottom of the stump, the energy, the nutrients of the tree are going to be devoted to these new growth instead of the part that I want to get thicker and stronger. And so you just prune those ones off. Where we give our energy are the branches that will be thriving. Where we give our attention, where we give our resources, where we give our time, those are the branches that will thrive. And so when I hear Jesus talk this way, he's saying, if you abide in me, you will have thriving growth, but you will also need to attend to those shoots that are taking the best stuff, the best nutrients, the best that I have and that life has to offer, and you will be directing it into the wrong place. So trim those off and keep your focus on what is most important. Some of us are pretty good at regulating that for ourselves. We hold ourselves accountable. We may have a strong prayer life. We may read through Scripture and say, I could do better at that. Here's something that I'm doing well in. These are things that I need to make changes in. And then there are the times that we need others to help correct us or redirect us. That's why it's so important to have a faith community. That's why church matters so much. We have all been tempted to think, I feel like I got this, I'm good, I don't need a church to be a part of, or I can be a part of a church community when I want to be, but I'm perfectly okay with doing my own thing most of the time. And then when I need a check-in, when I need a recharge, when I need to do my spiritual health checkup, I go touch base with church or the community again. But that doesn't really work. We are meant to be in community. We are meant to help each other. And we are meant to sometimes course correct in a way that we can't see for ourselves, and we need the accountability of others to do. That's why we have churches. That's why we have small groups. That's why we have studies. That's why we have circles of close-knit friends who are fellow believers who can call us out on the things that need to be corrected, or when we say, I need help, they can offer that help. There was a member of my family who became very, very ill a number of years ago. So ill that this family member ended up being hospitalized for many, many weeks. During the process of this illness, this person's lungs became compromised, and the lungs were no longer able to oxygenate the blood, and the heart began to suffer, and the blood wasn't flowing properly to the brain, and oxygen deprivation and blood lack of circulation was starting to be a problem, and so the lungs and the heart in this individual began to shut down. During that process, in order to save them, the doctors had to take them in for an emergency procedure where they made an incision in the side of this person's neck and opened up their carotid artery. The carotid artery then was replaced with a tube that was an inflow tube and a tube that was an outflow tube, and went to a heart-lung bypass machine called ECMO. And this ECMO machine then took blood out, put fresh oxygenated blood in, and maintained blood flow to the brain. Now, it was a touchy day, the day that this individual had to come off ECMO, because you can't stay perpetually on this, and this person was in medically induced paralysis because they had to be basically in a medical coma in order for this process to work as their body began to recover and heal. And so what ended up happening is that the day that they came off of this, they pulled those two cannula out of their neck, and the doctors sewed the carotid artery shut. Now, it had been a long time since I had been in any kind of biology class, so I needed a refresher on this, but you have a carotid artery on both sides of your neck, and our bodies miraculously are made in such a way that if you don't have access on one side anymore, in other words, this became a dead-end street on this side could do all of the work. But the other thing that I learned in the process that was so fascinating was that was only a short-term measure for the carotid artery on the one side of the body to do all the work. Because what ended up happening on the other side was something called collateral arteries were being formed. And so instead of just one main tube carrying the blood up and down from the brain, now little offshoots, like little branches, almost like sea coral, began to pop up and slowly connect to each other and make their way up to the brain. And so now this individual not only has an intact carotid artery on one side of their head, but on the other side, these collateral arteries began to form and does the blood flow now, so that there is, throughout the whole brain, this blood flow taking place. And because it's through arteries, this is called arteriogenesis, the creation of new arteries. In fact, we have a picture of this because I think it's just easier to look at the diagram. See the blood flow coming in at the top, and then you see that big black blockage. And all of a sudden, these collateral arteries come off the side, do a detour around the blockage, and then pick back up again in the main artery. When Jesus talks about the vine and the branches, I think what happens for many of us is we get to a place where all of a sudden we might end up at a problem spot or a roadblock. Or we think that, what if I am one of those branches that feels like it's been cut off because I have lost my connection in some way? In fact, I was talking with two different women over the past few months, and both had similar origin stories but very different outcomes. They both said that they grew up in religious traditions that they loved while they were children, but at some point it became something that they felt like they could no longer continue to believe in the way that they had been taught. Their questions were discouraged. They didn't feel as welcome or at home in their community anymore. They were encouraged to think in a particular kind of way, but not to go outside of that very constrictive box. And what ended up happening was the first woman I talked to said, I left the church because I didn't think that there was a place for me, and I've never been back. And for her, it feels like she was like a branch that was pruned because it reached a dead end and just stopped right there. And I told her that that didn't need to be the end of her story, and that there were places that she could go where she might find a faith community to continue her journey in. But then I spoke to a different person who's told a similar origin kind of story, but then she said she was invited to a church that she felt welcomed in, that her conversations were encouraged, that she could ask her deepest and hardest questions, and she was not turned away, and she was welcomed as she was. And she found that there was a group of people who other fellow branches merged with hers and brought her back into the main artery of the vine of Christ again. It was an Arteriogenesis moment for her in her faith. This is why, while many of us are able to recognize the places that need pruning and to redirect, and we're able to do that, there are others of us who need that community, who need the fellow branches on the vine to help join with us and redirect us in and bring us back in. And many of you are here today because you had that kind of person in your life. Come with me and visit my church. I think you'll really like it. We've been away for a while, but we want to get plugged in again. I want to be at a kind of a place where my questions are encouraged instead of suppressed. I want to be at a place where there are others who will help direct me back into what it means to abide in the vine of Christ. Rabbi Kushner, who many of you have read some of his books, wrote a book a few years ago on the 23rd Psalm. And we talked about the shepherding imagery in last week's sermon. And I think that just a few chapters before today's about the vine and the branches, Jesus is using this shepherd, sheep gate, sheepfold, hired hand, good shepherd metaphor. And he was talking in this book about walking through the valley in the 23rd Psalm and that shepherding kind of pastoral imagery. And he talked about the importance of community again. And he points out, and I think that this is interesting, the root of the word religion has the same root as the word for ligament. The interconnectedness. Those pieces that remind us that body is an apt metaphor for who we are as the church. We are the body. We are here for one another. We are a part of one vine with many branches, but we help gather each other back in, steering one another back into the true vine, especially when we get towards the edges and we find the dead ends or the places that need to be pruned, but that need not be the end of the story. We're brought back in. So as I'm reading this text of Jesus speaking about the vine, I can't help but think about not just vines, but ligaments and arteries and groups and congregations and circles of friends and covenant partners and all of the things that remind us that we are interconnected deeply. And so let me ask you this. If you are feeling like maybe you are reaching a spot where it feels like the end, is this something that you can redirect yourself, or do you need to seek the wisdom and the guidance and the encouragement and the love of others to help redirect you? Are there those in your life who you feel like are reaching the edges of what feels like, no, we're going to move into the dangerous territory here, and they have separated themselves from the vine in a way that feels unhelpful or risky or dangerous? Can you be that friend that calls them back in? Is there someone that you have been a regular partner with in terms of friendship and ministry at this church that you haven't seen in a while, that you desire to reconnect with and you'd like to see them brought back into the fold and into the vine? Have you reached out to them? And what are the ways that we continue to practice what it means to abide in Christ? If we read just a few more verses on from where Luann stopped this morning, we'll find the part where Jesus says, because when you abide in me, because when you are a branch connected, fully intact to the vine, you will find a pure joy. You will find a joy that can only be found in me. And so it's not about bringing people back in because they've gone astray and they're guilty and they're reckless and they're going off the deep end. No, no, no. It's about calling them back in to the joy that we can have. And your joy and my joy and their joy is greater when we maintain that connection together. So, as we close this sermon in prayer, I'd like you to think about if you fall into one of those categories as someone who maybe needs to be reminded of that redirection and where that pruning needs to take place. Or maybe there's someone that comes to mind for you that may be worth reaching out to with a phone call or a text or a visit this week. Maybe it's someone that needs a note of encouragement, a gesture of kindness. Or maybe it's that person that you know felt like they cut themselves off from the faith a long time ago because they felt like the faith as they understood it was too limiting. It wouldn't allow them to grow and explore. And so they hit a dead end on their branch. Who comes to mind for you in this moment? And let's now offer up a word of prayer.